The corridors of the Royal Palace of Madrid were silent that day in 1834, but it was not the stillness of peace. It was the oppressive quiet that follows the death of a king. Ferdinand VII was gone, but the duties of his royal physician were not, and summoned to the private chambers of the late monarch, I entered knowing that grief would not be the only presence in the room. Maria Christina, the Queen Regent, stood before me. Her eyes were red, her face set in the pale mask of someone who had not slept, yet her composure was unshaken by the political storm gathering outside the palace walls. Ere she spoke without flourish, as if each word was pulled from her throat by necessity rather than choice. And what she asked of me was neither an ordinary medical task nor a ceremonial act of state. It was something so strange, so grotesque, that it momentarily stopped my breath. Her voice trembled only once, when she told me exactly what needed to be preserved. Not the king's face, not his hands, not the features that painters had immortalized in oils for decades. Nay, she wanted me to preserve that, and the one part of Ferdinand's body that had shaped his reign as surely as his policies, wars, and betrayals. I approached the bed where the king lay in death. The air was thick with the scent of incense, but it could not hide the smell of the body cooling beneath silk sheets. The lifeless face, already slack in repose, seemed to wear a mocking half-smile, as though even now, the man who had ruled Spain with paranoia and cruelty for nearly 2 decades could still humiliate those around him. But I did not linger on his expression. My attention was drawn to the strange weight beneath the sheets, the object that had been both his private shame and his perverse pride, the anatomical monstrosity that physicians had whispered about in locked rooms, never daring to write in official reports, but which had become an open secret in every court of Europe. As I prepared the instruments and preservatives, my mind wandered not to medical theory or procedure, but to the countless whispered stories I had heard in these gilded halls, of the special cushions made in secrecy by royal craftsmen, of wives whose screams echoed down the corridors on their wedding nights, of desperate attempts to produce an heir, no matter the cost in pain or dignity. It occurred to me that I was not merely preserving flesh and tissue. I was preserving a symbol, a physical manifestation of a reign that was itself deformed and destructive, just as this organ was misshapen, oversized, and functionally flawed. So too had Ferdinand's rule been twisted, bloated, and harmful to everything it touched. Outside, Madrid was still wearing its mask of mourning, but inside these chambers, the truth of Ferdinand's legacy lay bare before me. I could already see the threads of his personal curse woven through the history of Spain, threads that would pull us backward in time to understand how this man had come to embody both the decay of a dynasty and the ruin of a nation. To understand the dead man before me, we would have to return to his beginning before the throne, before the marriages, before the terror to the poison roots of his bloodline. Long before Ferdinand VII drew his first breath, the foundations of his life had already been laid in the marriages and mistakes of those who came before him. His story began not with his birth, but with the centuries-long decay of Spain's ruling houses, a slow, deliberate erosion of vitality, brought on by one of the most destructive traditions in royal Europe, inbreeding, and the Habsburgs and the Bourbons. Each, in their turn, had bound themselves together through cousin to cousin, uncle to niece unions. This was no accident of romance, it was policy. Dynastic strategy demanded pure bloodlines, and so generations of monarchs wed their own kin, tightening the genetic noose with each passing marriage. The results were predictable to any physician, but ignored by kings and queens more concerned with legitimacy than longevity. By the late 18th century, Spain's royal family had become a living ledger of hereditary afflictions, mental instability, infertility, physical deformities, and the slow, inevitable collapse of the body's natural balance. Ferdinand VII was the unfortunate sum of this arithmetic. Born on October the 14th, 1784, in the palace of El Escorial, he was the son of King Charles IV and Queen Maria Louisa of Parma, first cousins in both blood and political alliance. Theirs was not a marriage of affection, but an arrangement designed to keep power contained within the family's gilded cage. Any hope of a healthy heir had been crippled from the start. Even as a child, there were signs that nature had not dealt Ferdinand a fair hand, and the boy's features carried the unmistakable imprint of his forebears' genetic repetition, a slightly misshapen jaw, a pallor that clung to him even in the heat of summer, and a delicate constitution prone to fevers. But there was something else, something the physicians noticed early, but spoke of only in guarded whispers. By adolescence, the quiet observations became private consultations among court doctors. The prince's anatomy was developing in ways that defied both proportion and function. It was a cruel paradox, an organ of such extraordinary size and peculiar shape that it was both a marvel and a disability. In an age when physical moderation was considered the mark of aristocratic refinement, Ferdinand's condition branded him as an anomaly, a freak of nature concealed beneath layers of silk and ceremony. Court gossip is as relentless as the tide, and even the highest walls could not keep the whispers contained, and servants traded half-heard stories in the kitchens. Tutors learned to choose their words carefully in his presence. Foreign diplomats sent discreet but tantalizing reports back to their capitals. Every joke, every sideways glance was a potential humiliation for the young prince. Humiliation, as it turned out, was the most formative inheritance he received. It bred in him a deep suspicion of others, a readiness to interpret every smile as mockery, every conversation as conspiracy. The legacy of inbreeding had not only twisted his body, it had begun to twist his mind. In the portraits of his youth, you would not see a monster, and the artists, sworn to flattery, captured only the surface, the stiff posture, the ceremonial attire, the carefully composed gaze of a royal heir. The paintings lie by omission. They cannot show the shadow that was already growing inside him, the seed planted by centuries of royal vanity and ignorance. And so, the stage was set, and a boy, born into the suffocating embrace of a cursed bloodline, carrying in his body a deformity that would shape his life, his reign, and the fate of an empire. The world beyond the palace walls was already shifting Spain's colonies restless, its economy faltering, its politics brittle under the weight of weak kings and stronger ministers. But for young Ferdinand, the battles of the future would first be fought in the privacy of his own chambers. And when he came of age, those private battles would collide violently with the public obligations of monarchy, beginning with the most essential duty of any king marriage. By the time Ferdinand reached his late teens, what had once been a whispered concern among court physicians had become an undeniable reality. The strange development of his anatomy was no passing irregularity. It was a permanent and defining feature of his body. In private consultations, royal doctors abandoned the language of polite reassurance and began documenting the condition with clinical precision. Their notes, locked away in sealed chests and Vatican archives, describe an organ of such disproportionate dimensions and unusual form that it challenged both medical understanding and marital expectation. One early report, written by a court surgeon under oath of secrecy, tried to cloak the truth in restrained medical jargon. His Royal Highness is afflicted with a member of extraordinary length and unorthodox girth. That intimate congress may present considerable difficulty. Another physician, dispensing with euphemism, compared the organ to a billiard cue slender at the base, swelling to the size of a man's fist at the tip, with a curvature most unnatural to its purpose. The condition was more than an aesthetic oddity. The extreme disparity in thickness from base to extremity, the pronounced bend in the shaft, and the presence of unexplained tissue growths rendered normal sexual function nearly impossible without severe risk of pain or injury to a partner. And in an era when a king's worth was inseparable from his ability to produce heirs, this private misfortune loomed like a political threat. Ferdinand felt the weight of that threat long before his coronation. Adolescence, which for most young men brings a mixture of pride and uncertainty, for him was a season of dread. His education in the duties of a royal husband was less about courtly romance and more about mechanical feasibility, how to minimize harm, how to position the body, what supports could be used on. Royal craftsmen, sworn to secrecy on pain of exile or worse, were tasked with designing custom cushions, supports, and implements to facilitate an act that should have required none of these things, but secrecy in a royal court is never absolute. Servants glimpsed strange contraptions being carried discreetly through back corridors. Artisans spoke too freely in their taverns. By the time Ferdinand was 17, rumors of his royal peculiarity had spread far enough that foreign diplomats included it in their confidential assessments of the Spanish succession. In the game of dynastic marriage, such intelligence was invaluable and dangerous. The boy who might have been a proud and curious prince instead grew into a watchful, guarded figure. He interpreted politeness as condescension, laughter as insult. His paranoia was not wholly unfounded. People were speaking of him, but his response was disproportionate and increasingly cruel. A chamber page who once accidentally entered while the prince was changing was not merely dismissed from service. His family was expelled from Madrid altogether. The message was unambiguous: to witness the king's shame was to invite ruin. These formative years shaped the cruelty that would later define Ferdinand's reign. He learned to wield his authority as both shield and sword, shielding his secret, striking at any perceived threat. Those who served him lived under the constant shadow of his suspicion, where a misplaced glance or an overheard joke could destroy a career or a life. Yet beneath the layers of pride and intimidation was a more corrosive force: humiliation. Every political lesson he absorbed from his tutors, every diplomatic reception he attended, was filtered through the unspoken truth of his condition. While other young royals practiced charm and gallantry, Ferdinand cultivated control over his environment, over his subordinates, and this above all, for the narrative of who he was. Soon enough, the necessity of royal duty would demand that this carefully guarded private flaw be tested in the most public of ways: a marriage alliance. And the first bride chosen for him would learn, on her wedding night, that her future held not a fairy tale prince, but an ordeal unlike anything she could have imagined. The match had been arranged years before they met. Ferdinand, now 18, was to wed his first cousin, Princess Maria Antonia of Naples and Sicily, another thread in the tightly knotted web of Bourbon bloodlines. For the Spanish court, the union was a matter of dynastic strategy, binding two branches of the family in the hope of consolidating political strength. For the bride, It was the fulfillment of a carefully tended romantic vision. Maria Antonia arrived in Madrid with the wide-eyed optimism of a sheltered royal raised on tales of gallant princes and noble duty. She had heard Ferdinand spoken of as El Deseado, the desired one, a flattering title born of political propaganda, not personal knowledge. In her mind, she was stepping into a life of regal ceremony and mutual affection. The wedding preparations only reinforced the illusion-gilded carriages, processions through cheering crowds, cathedral bells pealing in perfect harmony. The ceremony itself was magnificent, and court musicians filled the cavernous cathedral with soaring harmonies, while tapestries depicting the royal lineage draped the walls like the proud history they were meant to preserve. From the outside, the union was flawless, a pairing of youth, beauty, and noble blood, but the facade began to crack almost immediately after the public vows were spoken, and while the city feasted and fireworks lit the night sky, the palace corridors fell unnaturally silent as Maria Antonia's ladies-in-waiting were approached with an unusual request. Ferdinand's valet, speaking in hushed tones, explained that special preparations would be required for the wedding night. Custom cushions were to be brought in, and certain oils and salves laid out. Implements that seemed more suited to a medical theatre than a bridal chamber were quietly delivered. These attendants, bound by etiquette and fear, asked no questions. Maria Antonia herself was told nothing of substance, only that certain customs were observed in the Spanish court. Her upbringing had been carefully curated to maintain her innocence. Her knowledge of marital duties was vague and abstract, framed in the soft euphemisms of older women who knew better than to speak plainly. When Ferdinand entered the bridal chamber and the first sight of her husband undressed shattered that innocence in an instant. One of her ladies, writing years later in a private memoir, recalled the moment Her Majesty screamed as though confronted by a demon. She backed into the wall, pointing and crying, "Monster, monster," until her voice broke. The scale and grotesque curvature of the king's organ long, thickened unnaturally at the tip, with irregular tissue growths were unlike anything she had imagined possible in human form. What followed was less a consummation than a controlled procedure. The royal physicians, already stationed nearby, entered to explain to the horrified young queen what must be done. The specially crafted cushions were positioned, oils applied, and Ferdinand's body arranged with the care of a surgical patient. Even so, the act was physically traumatic for Maria Antonia, and she was administered laudanum to dull both the pain and the shock. For Ferdinand, the night was a collision of his deepest insecurities and his most stubborn entitlement. Her terror confirmed the shame he had carried since adolescence. Yet in the same breath, he saw her fear as a personal insult, a refusal of the obedience owed to him as husband and king-to-be. The marriage began under the twin shadows of humiliation and resentment. From that night onward, intimacy between them would be an ordeal scripted by physicians, supported by mechanical aids, and measured in failed attempts at conception. What should have been a private foundation for trust became, instead, a ritual of physical injury and emotional withdrawal. The political alliance was intact, but the personal union was already broken, and as months turned into years without the birth of an heir, the court's whispers grew louder, feeding both Ferdinand's paranoia and Maria Antonia's dread. The king's solution to this problem would only deepen the nightmare for them both. The early months of the marriage were a study in controlled failure. Each attempt at consummation followed the same grim choreography, the special cushions arranged, oils and salves applied, laudanum administered until Maria Antonia's eyelids grew heavy, but her body remained pliable. The physician's men, sworn to silence under penalty of exile, stood just beyond the door, ready to intervene if the act became too dangerous. When these methods failed to produce a pregnancy, Ferdinand's desperation began to warp into obsession. He ordered the chamber prepared on rigid schedules tied to Maria Antonia's menstrual cycle, and sessions were timed to the minute. The Queen's diet monitored for foods believed to enhance fertility, and he began consulting foreign physicians, alchemists, and herbalists, each arriving at court with promises of miraculous cures for the royal impediment, and the treatments were as varied as they were futile. Ferdinand consumed powdered rhinoceros horn and ground pearls, believing they would balance the humours. He swallowed bitter tonics laced with mercury, bathed in herbal infusions, and even submitted to electrical stimulation, an experimental practice whispered about in certain European medical circles. For Maria Antonia, the interventions were equally bizarre. Potions meant to soften the womb, fumigations with pungent herbs, and strict regimens of rest punctuated by sudden demands for intimacy at astrologically chosen hours. When science failed, superstition filled the void. Ferdinand summoned astrologers to chart the heavens, seeking auspicious nights for conception. One mystic from the East convinced him that his dragon's rod was a sign of divine favour, requiring ritual purification to unlock its fertility. For 3 months, the royal couple endured ceremonies of incense and chanting, their bodies arranged in contorted postures said to align cosmic energies. However, pregnancies did result, but both ended in devastation. In 1804, Maria Antonia miscarried in her 4th month, a loss the court physicians diplomatically attributed to her delicate constitution. In private, they admitted the likely truth: the repeated trauma of their intimate life had made sustaining a pregnancy nearly impossible. The second miscarriage, in 1805, was far worse. Nearly to term, the Queen went into a labour so violent and bloody it nearly killed her. The child, another would-be heir, was lost, and Maria Antonia never recovered her physical or emotional strength. Her dependence on laudanum deepened into addiction. Her once bright eyes dulled, and her presence in the palace became spectral. Ferdinand's reaction to these tragedies revealed the ugliest edges of his nature. He accused his wife of sabotaging their chances of moving deliberately during intercourse to prevent conception, of taking secret powders to induce miscarriage, even of harbouring liberal sympathies that made her unwilling to bear a Catholic heir. The accusations were whispered loudly enough to poison the air around her. Under this cloud of suspicion, Maria Antonia retreated into prayer, convinced by the relentless pressure that she was cursed. She spent long hours kneeling before the chapel altar, murmuring for forgiveness for sins she could not name. In those moments, the young queen who had once arrived in Madrid with a heart full of hope had become a penitent ghost in silks and lace. The ritual of despair had become the rhythm of their marriage. Each new attempt was a cycle of preparation, endurance, and recovery, followed by either silence or accusations. For Ferdinand, the failures only hardened his resolve to try again. For Maria Antonia, they deepened the certainty that survival meant not living, but enduring. And in the spring of 1807, her endurance finally gave way. On a mild day in May 1807, the bells of Madrid tolled for Queen Maria Antonia. Official proclamations spoke of a fever, of her fragile constitution finally yielding to years of ill health. The court mourned with solemn ceremony, black crape draped over balconies. and the royal chapel filled with incense and Latin requiems. But behind the closed doors of the palace, the whispers began before her body was even cold. There were those who believed Maria Antonia had not died by nature's hand. Rumors spread that she had been poisoned not by political enemies, but by the man who shared her bed. To some, it made a brutal kind of sense. Ferdinand, impatient for an heir, weary of a wife whose presence reminded him of failure, might have sought a fresh start with a new bride. The most tantalizing piece of gossip came from the sudden and suspicious death of the palace apothecary. Just days after the Queen's passing, he was found lifeless in his chambers. Before his body was removed, guards discovered a sealed letter on his desk. Ferdinand's agents seized it immediately, and it was never seen again. Court servants whispered that it contained either a confession of poisoning at the king's order or a revelation of the king's true medical condition, evidence that could humiliate the crown if it reached the wrong hands. If the accusations reached Ferdinand's ears, he gave no sign. In public, he performed the role expected of a grieving husband: black attire, bowed head, eyes moist during the funeral mass, but those closest to him noticed an absence of the heaviness that grief leaves behind. In private, he seemed lighter, relieved. Within weeks, his attention had turned to the question of remarriage. For Ferdinand, marriage was not about companionship or affection. It was a political and biological transaction. Maria Antonia's death was not a wound. It was an opportunity to try again, to secure the one thing his reign would require above all else: an heir of his own blood. His inquiries, sent discreetly through diplomatic channels, targeted women who had already proven their fertility. Widows and princesses with children from previous marriages were prioritized, their proven ability to bear healthy offspring more valuable than youth or beauty. The king's physicians, meanwhile, returned to their grim work. Maria Antonia's death meant a new queen might soon arrive, and with her, the need to adapt or improve the devices, supports, and procedures required for Ferdinand's marital duties. Workshops hidden deep within the palace resumed their production of custom aids, the artisans working under the same strict oaths of silence that had shrouded the first marriage. If the courtiers expected Ferdinand to emerge from this loss humbled or chastened, they misjudged him. The years of tension, humiliation, and suspicion had only reinforced his most dangerous traits: paranoia, entitlement, and an utter lack of empathy. The next bride would not be met with patience, but with a king more determined than ever to bend another life to his will, no matter the cost. And in 1816, that bride would arrive in Madrid, 9 years after Maria Antonia's death. The bells of Madrid rang once again, not in mourning, but in celebration. Ferdinand VII, now a king in his own right, was to marry his second wife, Maria Isabel of Portugal, like his first bride, and she was also his cousin, a Bourbon-Habsburg union forged in the same close circle of European royalty. Her youth, just 19, was matched by her optimism. Raised in the Portuguese court, she had been told she was marrying a powerful and desirable monarch, a match that would strengthen the bonds between their two nations. From the outside, the wedding was an affair of pure spectacle. Streets were lined with cheering crowds, balconies draped in silks, and the cathedral glittered with gold leaf and candlelight. Foreign dignitaries filled the pews, and the Spanish press lavished praise on the match. It was a carefully staged performance meant to project stability, prosperity, and the continuity of the royal line. And yet beneath the pageantry and the machinery of Ferdinand's private world was already turning. The king's physicians and artisans had been busy in the weeks leading up to the ceremony, preparing the marital aids that would make the wedding night possible, and special cushions, oils, and surgical-grade supports were readied in the same clandestine manner as before, hidden from all but the most trusted attendants. Maria Isabel's ladies-in-waiting were briefed only in vague terms. Certain preparations would be necessary, as is customary for the king. Nothing could have prepared the young queen for the reality. That night, when the palace finally fell quiet and the attendants withdrew, Isabel faced her new husband for the first time in the privacy of the royal chambers. The moment her eyes fell upon the truth of his anatomy, witnesses later claimed, she froze, as if turned to stone. Then came the scream, sharp, high, and carrying down the marble corridors like a blade through still air. Servants stationed beyond the door exchanged uneasy glances. Those who had served during Ferdinand's first marriage recognized the sound, but this time it was accompanied by the thud of overturned furniture and the muffled cries of a struggle. When the door was eventually opened, the evidence of what had transpired was clear blood-stained sheets, broken bed supports, and a bride pale as death, her eyes fixed on nothing. From that night forward, Maria Isabel's demeanor changed, and court observers noted that she began to stutter when speaking in her husband's presence, her voice faltering mid-sentence, as though she feared every word might provoke him. She avoided his gaze, flinched at sudden movements, and suffered what her physicians called hysterical episodes, bursts of tears, trembling fits, and nights spent pacing her chambers until exhaustion forced her to sleep. Ferdinand interpreted her fear not as a sign of trauma, but as a challenge to his authority. His paranoia deepened, convinced that his young wife was mocking him behind closed doors or conspiring with her attendants to spread tales of his private matters. Letters she sent to her family in Portugal were intercepted. Her food was tasted for poison. The Queen's chambers became a gilded cage patrolled by the King's chosen guards. To the public, Ferdinand and Maria Isabel appeared together at court functions, the Queen smiling with careful poise, the King projecting the image of a devoted husband. But behind the palace walls, their marriage was as cold and calculated as the equipment used to maintain it. For Ferdinand, the arrival of a second wife was not a chance at redemption. It was a renewed campaign in the same war he had waged with Maria Antonia, to force an heir into existence through any means necessary. And soon, his obsession with that goal would turn their marriage bed into something even more grotesque, a public theatre for medical experimentation. By 1817, the royal bedchamber of Spain had ceased to resemble a private sanctuary and had instead become a laboratory, one where the subject was the king himself, and the experiment was the conception of an heir. Ferdinand, unwilling to accept his second marriage's failure in silence, invited an ever-widening circle of experts to observe and advise on his most intimate encounters. And it began with his own physicians, who now took notes openly, sketching diagrams and making recommendations in the same tone they might use to discuss a surgical procedure day. But soon, the circle expanded to include foreign anatomists, visiting surgeons from France and Germany, and even so-called specialists with questionable credentials, circus performers who claimed expertise in unusual anatomy. Eastern mystics promising fertility rituals, and self-styled scholars of marital mechanics. These sessions were not whispered about. They were spoken of in careful, coded language among the highest ranks of the court. Everyone knew that the king was subjecting his marriage to a kind of grotesque public scrutiny, though few dared put the truth into words. Those who were allowed into the bedchamber, men trained to think clinically nonetheless, left with pale faces, their discomfort betraying the unnaturalness of what they had witnessed. Maria Isabel, for her part, endured these invasions with a hollow-eyed resignation. Her personal ladies reported that she would sometimes sit motionless for hours before the scheduled sessions, staring at the wall as though trying to leave her own body in anticipation of what was to come. The physicians referred to her as compliant, but in truth, she had simply retreated into herself. The effects of Ferdinand's obsession began to ripple outward, beyond the palace gates. Political allies whispered concerns about the king's priorities. How could a ruler devote the necessary energy to governing an empire when he was consumed by his own anatomical dilemma? Ministers waited days, sometimes weeks, for decisions on critical matters, because the king was preoccupied with new marital strategies or in recovery from particularly strenuous procedures beyond Spain. The monarch's private failures began to take on a diplomatic weight. In the rebellious colonies of the Americas, revolutionary leaders seized on the rumors, painting Ferdinand as a symbol of dynastic decay. Pamphlets mocked him as a sterile tyrant, claiming his inability to produce an heir was divine punishment for his misrule. In places like Mexico and Buenos Aires, such propaganda became a powerful rallying cry. The king, who could not rule his own household, they argued, had no right to rule a continent. Ferdinand's response to this humiliation was predictable paranoia hardened into policy. He ordered the restoration of the Inquisition in certain regions, directing it to investigate not only political dissent, but also slander against the dignity of the crown, a vague charge that could mean anything from spreading revolutionary pamphlets to privately joking about the king's condition. Inside the palace, the queen's health deteriorated. She suffered chronic fevers, weight loss, and what her physicians delicately described as nervous exhaustion. Whether these ailments were caused by the physical toll of her marital duties, the psychological strain, or both, the result was the same: she became increasingly unable to fulfill the role of a royal consort. In January 1818, after barely 2 years of marriage, Maria Isabel collapsed in her chambers and never recovered. The official cause of death was nervous exhaustion complicated by fever. In private, her attendants whispered of a woman driven to the edge by a marriage that was less a partnership than an unending medical trial. With her death, Ferdinand had failed once again to secure the one thing he believed would cement his reign. And yet, as the mourning veils were drawn over the palace, his thoughts turned immediately not to grief, but to the next candidate for queen, because for Ferdinand, marriage was not a bond of love, nor even of companionship. It was a problem to be solved, a vessel for a single purpose producing an heir. No matter how many lives were broken in the attempt, Maria Josefa Amalia of Saxony arrived in Madrid in 1819, under no illusions about romance. At 24, she was older than Ferdinand's previous brides and carried herself with a quiet, deliberate composure. Her family's finances were strained, and the match, though notorious in its risks, offered the stability and prestige her relatives desired. She had been thoroughly briefed by Saxon physicians who had corresponded privately with their Spanish counterparts. She knew of the royal impediment and came prepared, both mentally and materially. From the moment of her arrival, the atmosphere was different. The wedding was less ostentatious than Ferdinand's earlier nuptials. The cathedral still glimmered with gold, the choir still soared with sacred music, but there was a sense among the courtiers that this was no grand romance, this was a transaction. Even the foreign envoys attending seemed to watch with the detached curiosity of men observing an experiment rather than a celebration. Maria Josefa's approach to her marriage was pragmatic, almost clinical. She brought with her an array of medical devices supports, custom cushions, specially formulated ointments crafted in Saxony, with the express purpose of easing the king's condition. She also brought her personal physician, a man experienced in what were euphemistically called difficult marital circumstances. The wedding night, while still physically taxing, lacked the screams and chaos that had haunted the palace in previous unions. Instead, it unfolded with the methodical precision of a surgical procedure, positions calculated in advance, equipment laid out like instruments on an operating table, instructions given in measured tones. If Maria Josefa was afraid, she did not show it. She treated the encounter as a problem to be managed, not an ordeal to be endured. But Ferdinand, accustomed to fear, revulsion, and resistance, found her composure unsettling. The king began to suspect that his new queen viewed him less as a husband and more as a medical subject, and his paranoia, never far from the surface, flared. He ordered her correspondence monitored. Convinced, she was sending reports to Saxon doctors about his anatomy. He began interrogating her attendants, searching for evidence of mockery or betrayal. Maria Josefa kept meticulous records of their scheduled intimacies, times, techniques, and results, hoping to identify patterns that might increase the likelihood of conception. These private notes, later discovered in Saxon archives, read less like a queen's diary and more like a laboratory log. In them, she recorded the duration of each encounter, the level of discomfort, the adjustments made to equipment, and any physical after-effects. Despite their precision, the months passed without pregnancy. Ferdinand cycled through every remedy and ritual he had tried before: herbal concoctions, exotic diets, astrological timing, but Maria Josefa's cool detachment seemed immune to the psychological pressure that had crushed his previous wives. The absence of fear frustrated him. In his mind, fear was a form of respect, and without it, he began to feel mocked. He grew more erratic, alternating between lavish displays of affection in public and sharp, suspicious interrogations in private. The palace staff learned to read the signs, a change in the king's gait, a particular clipped tone in his voice, and avoid the royal apartments when tensions were high. Outside the palace, Spain's empire was disintegrating. One by one, the colonies in the Americas broke away, taking with them the wealth that had sustained the crown for centuries. Cabinet meetings were delayed or abandoned altogether when the king was indisposed, which was often. The court whispered that the fate of nations was being decided or neglected according to the success or failure of the king's marital schedule. But in 1829, after a decade of fruitless attempts, the impossible seemed to happen. Maria Josefa became pregnant. The news electrified the court. Bells rang across Madrid, proclamations were issued, and for a brief moment, it seemed that Ferdinand's relentless, obsessive pursuit of an heir might finally bear fruit. The king, giddy with hope, doubled palace security and summoned the best physicians from across Europe to oversee the pregnancy. But hope would prove short-lived, and the tragedy that followed would leave Ferdinand more broken and more dangerous than ever. And the announcement of Maria Josefa's pregnancy spread through Madrid like wildfire. After years of whispered failure, the court erupted into a frenzy of relief and anticipation. Church bells rang across the capital. Cannon fire saluted from the ramparts, and the streets filled with cheering crowds. For a moment, the gloom that had hung over Ferdinand's reign seemed to lift. Here was the promise of continuity, the vindication of a king whose most intimate struggles had been the subject of private ridicule across Europe. Ferdinand reacted with a manic intensity that alarmed even his closest advisers. He ordered Maria Josefa's apartments sealed from unnecessary visitors. Guards were stationed in the corridors day and night. Her diet was planned with the precision of a military campaign. Every ingredient scrutinized for purity and prepared under the eyes of royal tasters. The king even had her bedding blessed by priests and sprinkled daily with holy water, convinced that spiritual intervention would protect both mother and child. Physicians from Spain, France, and Italy were summoned to form a medical council tasked with overseeing every stage of the pregnancy. Their instructions were detailed to the point of absurdity. Maria Josefa was to avoid sudden movements, loud noises, certain colors of clothing deemed unsettling, and even particular directions of prayer, which Ferdinand claimed might confuse the unborn soul. For a few months, everything seemed to proceed normally, but in the 7th month, complications arose: bleeding, abdominal pain, and a sudden decline in the queen's strength. Modern medicine would recognize the signs of placental abruption, a dangerous condition that, if managed quickly, could still result in a healthy birth. But the palace was no modern hospital, and Ferdinand's interference turned the crisis into catastrophe. Distrusting the French physician's recommendation for immediate delivery, the king insisted on delaying intervention until astrologers confirmed the most auspicious date. He summoned alchemists and mystics alongside the medical council, demanding that each offer a method to stabilize the womb. The chamber became a battleground of competing instructions, bleeding the queen to reduce excess heat, applying herbal compresses of dubious origin, chanting prayers, and fumigating the room with pungent incense that choked the attendants. On May 18, 1829, Maria Josefa went into premature labor. Ferdinand refused to leave the room, hovering over the physicians, interrupting their work with panicked questions and contradictory orders. And the delivery was brutal. Long hours of agony, punctuated by the king's muttered prayers and sudden outbursts of anger at the doctors for their slowness. As the child, a daughter, emerged tiny and struggling, she lived for only a few hours before succumbing to the complications of prematurity. And Maria Josefa survived the birth but was gravely weakened, her body racked with fever. Her palace physicians urged rest and seclusion, but Ferdinand, in his grief, insisted on constant access to her bedside. He spoke to her of trying again, of new devices and techniques, as though the ordeal had been nothing more than another failed experiment. 3 weeks later, Maria Josefa was dead. The official cause was childbed fever, but those who had watched her fade knew it was more than infection. She had been drained of strength long before the labor by years of mechanical intimacy, relentless scheduling, and the suffocating pressure to produce an heir. Ferdinand's reaction was grotesque. He refused to allow either mother or child to be buried immediately, insisting that his physicians attempt revival through a series of macabre procedures, applying heated cloths to the bodies, pouring herbal tinctures into their mouths, even surrounding them with relics in the hope of divine intervention. For nearly a week, the stench of decay filled the sealed apartments until, at last, the reality could no longer be denied. When the bodies were finally interred, Ferdinand commissioned death masks of both Maria Josefa and the infant, adding them to the grim collection of his previous wives' likenesses kept in his private chambers. Courtiers who visited him in the weeks that followed reported that he would sit before these masks for hours, speaking to them in low, urgent tones. But grief, for Ferdinand, was never the end of the matter. Within months, negotiations began for a fourth marriage. The throne was still without a secure heir, and in the king's mind, for that failure remained the one wound no amount of ceremony conquest, or cruelty could heal. By late 1829, Ferdinand was 45 years old, worn by decades of political turmoil, personal obsession, and the corrosive paranoia that had seeped into every aspect of his reign. Yet the machinery of dynastic politics demanded one more attempt at marriage. The Spanish court, desperate for stability, set its sights on Maria Christina of Naples and Sicily, a young woman of 23, charming, and most importantly, still of fertile age. The negotiations moved quickly, but behind the polished language of the marriage contracts lay a secret that would have destroyed the match had it been public. Maria Christina was already pregnant when the arrangements were finalized, and the child was not Ferdinand's. Whether Ferdinand knew from the beginning or convinced himself otherwise remains uncertain. What is certain is that he accepted the situation either through willful self-deception or the cold calculation that a ready-made heir, legitimate in the eyes of the law, was better than none at all, and the wedding, though grand, they carried a strange undercurrent. The court went through the motions, banquets, parades, the blessing of the royal union, but there was no mistaking the tension in the air. Foreign envoys exchanged discreet glances, aware of the rumors swirling through diplomatic channels. Maria Christina, poised and outwardly serene, concealed her pregnancy under the voluminous silks of her bridal gown. Her Ferdinand, resplendent in gold and jewels, smiled for the crowds, and his eyes never lingering long on his new queen. In 1830, she gave birth to a daughter, Isabella, later Isabella II of Spain, to the outside world, and the birth was a triumph, the long-awaited continuation of the Bourbon line. Inside the palace, however, was an unspoken arrangement built on mutual pretense. Ferdinand publicly claimed the child as his own, while Maria Christina maintained the fiction of his paternity. But the birth did not end Ferdinand's obsession, and if anything, it sharpened it, and he wanted a child that was unquestionably his, proved to himself and to history that his line could continue without the shadow of doubt. Thus began a new campaign, his fourth and final attempt to achieve what had eluded him for decades. The same patterns re-emerged, physicians summoned, devices commissioned, private sessions scheduled with mechanical precision. Maria Christina, though more politically astute than his previous wives, could not escape the king's invasive demands. She complied with the ritual of cushions, oils, and carefully arranged positions, but unlike the other Nabar, she also knew how to maneuver within the court's factional politics. She cultivated allies among the nobility, ensuring that her survival did not depend solely on the king's volatile favor. Ferdinand, meanwhile, allowed the paranoia that had always stalked him to extend fully into their marriage. He ordered secret passages built between their apartments so he could approach her unannounced. Servants reported that he had peepholes drilled into the walls to watch her when she thought herself alone while she nursed Isabella, prayed, or simply sat in silence. Her letters to her family were intercepted, her personal attendants interrogated, her meals subjected to elaborate tasting rituals that delayed dining for hours. Though Maria Christina managed to maintain a public image of dignity, the private toll was mounting. She began describing her life in intercepted letters as living in a gilded cage whose bars are invisible but unbreakable. She understood that Ferdinand's fixation on her was not truly about love or even lust. It was about control, about erasing the humiliation that had defined his life and reign. That the court, once again, found itself holding its breath for news of a royal pregnancy. But as the months turned into years, it became increasingly clear that no amount of ritual, device, or surveillance could undo the truth that had shadowed Ferdinand from birth. Nature had made his mission impossible, and with that impossibility came a new danger, not just for Maria Christina, but for the entire machinery of Spanish politics, as the king's obsession with producing a true heir began to consume his already fragile grasp on governance. By 1831, Ferdinand's fixation on Maria Christina had metastasized into a system of constant surveillance that blurred the line between domestic control and state security. The Queen lived under an unrelenting watch, every movement recorded, every word weighed. What had once been confined to the private chambers now extended across the entire palace, woven into the very architecture of their lives. Ferdinand ordered new hidden corridors and concealed doorways so he could appear in Maria Christina's rooms without warning. Peepholes were drilled into walls at strategic angles, allowing him to observe her during prayer, conversation, or simple solitude. Servants learned to keep their voices low when speaking in her presence. They could not be sure whether the king's eye was pressed against the other side of the wall. The scrutiny did not end at the threshold of her chambers. Her correspondence was intercepted and read aloud to Ferdinand, not for its political content alone, but for any trace of private defiance. The king demanded not only the content of her letters, but also reports on her tone, facial expressions, and the pressure of her handwriting, as if these could reveal disloyalty invisible to the naked eye. Meals became ceremonies of suspicion. Food tasters sampled every dish, then were made to wait under guard for half an hour before the plates were served, to ensure no slow-acting poison had been used. If a taster coughed or paled, the entire meal was discarded. These delays sometimes left Maria Christina's food cold and unappetizing, but she was expected to eat under Ferdinand's gaze regardless. The Queen's ladies-in-waiting, at once her companions, became informants willingly or under duress. Some feared the king's wrath if they failed to report. Others saw the opportunity to earn favor by feeding his paranoia. Even harmless details, what book she had read that afternoon, how long she lingered at the chapel altar, were passed along and interpreted through the lens of suspicion. Maria Christina adapted to survive. She cultivated a serene public persona, never allowing an expression of irritation or fatigue to cross her face in Ferdinand's presence. In private, however, she moved with calculated care, aware that at any moment a hidden observer might be watching. In a letter to her sister, one of the few that escaped interception, she likened her existence to living within glass walls, where one must always perform the role of a queen, even in the solitude of one's own soul. The king's paranoia bled into state affairs. Cabinet ministers were summoned to answer for imagined slights, their loyalty tested with contradictory instructions to see if they would dare correct him. Our ambassadors were watched almost as closely as the Queen, their audiences with her monitored, and later dissected in the king's private councils. Even religious devotion became suspect when Maria Christina increased her hours of prayer. Ferdinand demanded to know whether her petitions were for divine favor or secret communication with foreign Catholic powers. The atmosphere within the palace grew toxic. Courtiers spoke in code, glanced over their shoulders before entering rooms, and avoided the Queen's presence for fear of being implicated in whatever suspicions the king might nurse next. A careless word could mean reassignment to a remote posting or permanent disappearance. This was no longer merely a marriage under strain. It was a miniature surveillance state, with Ferdinand as both ruler and secret police. And like all systems built on paranoia, it could not remain confined to its original target. Soon, the king's gaze would fall on his entire court, and even his own family would not escape the net, because by 1832, the Spanish court had become a place where ceremony masked paralysis. On the surface, the grand rituals continued: receptions in gilded halls, military reviews, the slow, deliberate etiquette of a Bourbon monarchy. But beneath the glitter, the governance was grinding to a halt. Ferdinand's obsessions had reshaped the court's priorities, less a centre of administration than a theatre of loyalty tests. Ministers approached their audiences with the king as one might approach a dangerous animal, and every phrase had to be weighed, every gesture calculated to avoid triggering suspicion. Ferdinand's habit of issuing contradictory instructions had become legendary. If a minister pointed out the inconsistency, he risked being labelled disloyal. If he followed both orders blindly, then he risked ridicule for incompetence. Either way, and the king's judgment was less about policy and more about whether he believed you respected his authority without question. Family ties offered no protection. Even Don Carlos, Ferdinand's own brother and longtime supporter, found himself under investigation. Harmless remarks were twisted into signs of treachery. Visiting relatives were discreetly shadowed by palace guards, their conversations with the Queen monitored for hints of conspiracy. This climate of suspicion spread through every layer of the royal household. Servants avoided eye contact, fearing that a misplaced glance might be read as insolence. Musicians hesitated to play certain pieces in the Queen's presence, lest Ferdinand imagine hidden meanings in the lyrics or melodies. The palace kitchens became a staging ground for elaborate security measures. Meals prepared in multiple locations and brought together only at the last moment, as though the threat of poison lurked in every corridor. Beyond the palace walls, Spain was listing dangerously. The economy was weakened by the loss of its American colonies. Discontent's harm simmered among the provinces, and whispers of revolt reached the capital with increasing frequency. Yet cabinet meetings were postponed or cut short because the king was preoccupied with interrogating a guard about the Queen's afternoon walk, or demanding an inventory of her prayer books. Foreign ambassadors took careful note of the instability. Diplomatic correspondence from London, and Vienna began to include not just political analysis, but psychological assessments of the king's behaviour. In private, they discussed contingency plans for a Spain without Ferdinand, anticipating either a regency under Maria Christina or the potential for civil conflict if succession was disputed. Within the palace, the Queen maintained her calm facade, but the strain was visible. To those who saw her daily, she had grown thinner, her movements slower, her smile more practiced. In private moments with her trusted ladies, she spoke less of love or politics and more of survival. How to endure each day without provoking the king's anger. How to shield her daughter Isabella from the paranoia that hung over the family like a storm cloud. By the close of the year, the court was not merely dysfunctional, it was dangerous. A single rumour could ruin a career or a life. Trust was a currency no one could afford to spend, and Ferdinand's fixation was tightening toward a single, poisonous question: the true paternity of the child who bore his name. By 1832, Isabella, barely 2 years old, had become both Ferdinand's most prized possession and his most persistent torment. Officially, she was the heir to the Spanish throne, the living answer to decades of failure. Unofficially, she was a question mark. Ferdinand's mind circled that question endlessly. Was she truly mine? It was a thought he could not silence, yet in the privacy of his chambers, he scrutinized her features with almost scientific intensity, comparing the slope of her nose to his own portraits, the shape of her jaw to that of Maria Christina, the color of her eyes to rumors about other men in her wife's orbit before their marriage. Court painters were ordered to produce detailed likenesses of Isabella at each stage of her infancy. These were not sentimental keepsakes, but reference material. The king kept them in a locked cabinet, occasionally laying them side by side with miniature portraits of men he suspected might be the true father. The suspicions consumed him. Ferdinand began commissioning confidential inquiries into Maria Christina's past. His agents scoured Naples for servants who had attended her before the marriage, interrogating them about any relationships that could have produced a child. Physicians were ordered to study Isabella's growth for signs of hereditary traits, a task so vaguely defined it bordered on farce. Even the Queen's most mundane activities were twisted into evidence. A fond letter to her family in Naples became proof she was conspiring to undermine the succession. A gift to a trusted lady-in-waiting became a bribe to ensure silence. When Maria Christina requested a new set of chambers, Ferdinand accused her of seeking secret hiding places for correspondence with foreign agents or worse, for meeting an illicit lover. The king also sought scientific validation, though science in this era offered little more than the art of persuasive opinion. Genealogists, physicians, and court scholars were summoned to his private councils. They understood the danger of their task. A definitive answer displeasing to the king could be fatal. Their reports, carefully worded, offered no certainties, only observations that could be interpreted however Ferdinand wished. One described Isabella's bone structure as consistent with the Bourbon line, while noting certain delicate features that could not be conclusively attributed to either parent. Maria Christina endured this scrutiny with calculated restraint. She met accusations with polite denials, never raising her voice, never showing the anger that must have burned within her. In her private letters to her family, those that escaped interception, she described her life as a stage where I must act the role of loyal wife for an audience of one suspicious man. The tension was corrosive. Conversations between the king and queen, when they happened at all, were brief and formal, and Isabella herself became a pawn in the unspoken battle. Ferdinand would summon the child for long, silent inspections, holding her tiny hands and turning her face toward the light, as if the truth might suddenly reveal itself under closer examination. But no matter how many comparisons he made, how many secret investigations he launched, the question remained unanswered. And as the uncertainty festered, Ferdinand's suspicion spread outward, infecting his view of the entire court. If his own daughter's legitimacy could not be trusted, then no one's loyalty was beyond doubt. And that logic, if it could be called logic would push him further into isolation, deeper into paranoia, and dangerously close to the edge of collapse. By 1832, Ferdinand's body was failing in parallel with his mind. Years of nervous strain, erratic habits, and physical ailments, gout, digestive disorders, and chronic insomnia were taking their toll. His once stocky frame thinned, his skin grew sallow, and a persistent tremor in his hands betrayed the depth of his exhaustion. But if his body was weakening, his paranoia was only strengthening. The king's world had become a network of imagined plots, each thread leading back to his greatest fear, the loss of power, and the humiliation of personal exposure. Maria Christina remained at the center of his suspicions. Ferdinand began ordering invasive examinations before any physical contact with her, convinced she might be poisoning him through touch. Court physicians, uncomfortable but obedient, were forced to inspect the Queen in the King's presence, a ritual that stripped their marriage of any remaining dignity. These humiliations were not confined to the Queen. Ministers were subjected to loyalty tests so absurd they bordered on performance art. Ferdinand would issue contradictory orders in quick succession, then watch to see which instruction was followed first. Failure to navigate these traps often resulted in dismissal, exile, or assignment to some remote and inhospitable post. The king's speeches became rambling affairs, drifting from state matters into cryptic warnings about unseen enemies and cosmic portents. At public events, he would fixate on some trivial detail, a misplaced banner, a servant's posture, and interpreted it as a coded insult or sign of treachery. Courtiers learned to remain motionless in his presence, their expressions carefully neutral, their words stripped of anything that might carry unintended meaning behind closed doors. Ferdinand's private apartments were more shrine than living space, the death masks of his 3 previous wives, the failed devices meant to overcome his anatomical obstacle, and relics from fertility rituals long past crowded the room. Visitors reported that he spoke to the masks as if they could answer him, alternating between lamentations and accusations. The smell of stale incense clung to everything, as if the air itself was steeped in grief and suspicion. In the streets of Madrid, the people saw only glimpses of their king. Rumors of his ill health circulated freely, mingling with older whispers about his personal life. Revolutionary pamphlets mocked him as a man ruled by the ghosts of his bedchamber, a monarch whose greatest battles were fought against shadows of his own making. Early 1833, even Ferdinand's staunchest allies recognized that his ability to govern was crumbling. Foreign envoys noted signs of cognitive decline, confused recollections, sudden losses of focus, and the repetition of conspiracies already disproven, and his isolation deepened, and meetings were shorter, and decisions slower, and the machinery of state began to falter under his absence. The king was slipping toward the end, but there was still one act left in his reign, an end that would come quietly, yet leave behind a legacy of dysfunction so deep it would shape Spain's future for generations. The final months of Ferdinand's life were a slow collapse, not a dramatic fall. By the summer of 1833, he rarely left his private chambers. Chronic gout left him in constant pain. His digestion was erratic, and his speech often wandered into half-coherent mutterings about plots and punishments. The once imperious voice had grown hoarse, the once sharp gaze clouded by fatigue and suspicion. Even in these last days, Maria Christina remained under his constant surveillance, as though proximity to death only heightened his need for control. When the end came in September, it was almost anticlimactic. The official cause listed was gout complicated by exhaustion. The truth, murmured among the court physicians, was that Ferdinand had simply been worn out physically, mentally, and spiritually by decades of paranoia, political pressure, and the private humiliation that had shaped every year of his adult life. Maria Christina, and now Queen Regent for their daughter Isabella, immediately ordered the palace into deep mourning. Black crape hung from balconies, and the cathedral echoed with solemn masses. The people of Madrid, despite their grievances, lined the streets to watch the funeral procession, but behind the draped windows of the royal apartments, another, far stranger ritual was being prepared. At the request of Maria Christina, or perhaps under her reluctant consent, the king's physicians undertook a secret autopsy. Ostensibly, it was to confirm the cause of death. In reality, it was to examine, document, and preserve the physical anomaly that had defined Ferdinand's life and reign. The examination confirmed what decades of rumour had described: an organ of extraordinary length, over 14 inches in its natural state, with a dramatic variation in girth from base to tip, a pronounced curvature, an internal scarring so severe that normal sexual function would have been virtually impossible. The scarring, the doctors noted, bore signs of repeated, deliberate injury. It became clear that Ferdinand had won over many years. Attempted crude self-surgery, in misguided efforts to correct his condition procedures that had only worsened the deformity and added layers of psychological trauma to the physical one. The organ was preserved in a special solution, along with detailed anatomical sketches and written observations. These materials, deemed too politically dangerous and too grotesque for public knowledge, were sealed and sent to the Vatican archives. There they would remain, locked away from scholars and the public alike, a relic of a king's most guarded secret. Those few who saw the preserved specimen described it as both fascinating and unsettling, a biological oddity that told the story of a reign more truthfully than any royal portrait. It was a reminder that the political disasters of Ferdinand's rule were inseparable from the private burden he had carried, and that the man who had destroyed so much in Spain had also been, in some ways, destroyed from the start. And, while the king's body lay cold, the consequences of his life were still burning. Was left with a disputed succession, a fragile regency, and a kingdom deeply fractured by decades of misrule. The real autopsy was not of the man, but of the nation he left behind, dissecting the damage wrought by a reign where personal dysfunction had metastasized into political catastrophe. When Ferdinand VII died in September 1833, his body was buried with royal honours, but the kingdom he left behind was in a condition no ceremony could disguise. The succession was already poisoned with doubt. Isabella and the 3-year-old child he had claimed as his heir would inherit a throne under the regency of Maria Christina, but to many, the legitimacy of both mother and daughter remained suspect. The king's long history of failed marriages, his anatomical curse, and the whispered certainty that Isabella was not of his blood had given Spain's enemies exactly the leverage they needed. Almost immediately, the Carlist Wars erupted, led by Ferdinand's brother Don Carlos, who rejected Isabella's claim and presented himself as the rightful king. The political divisions tore the country in two, the conservative Carlists versus the liberals and moderates who rallied behind Maria Christina and Isabella in this conflict. The consequences of Ferdinand's personal failures became national disasters. What began as the private tragedy of a monarch's inability to produce an undisputed heir now became a civil war that would cost tens of thousands of lives. Economically, Fenium was crippled, as its Swine. The loss of its American colonies during Ferdinand's reign had stripped the empire of wealth and influence. Internally, decades of reactionary policy, censorship, and purges had stifled reform, leaving the country ill-prepared for the political upheavals sweeping Europe. Ferdinand's paranoia had hollowed out his government. Competent ministers had been driven away, and loyalty had been rewarded over skill. Socially, the court he left behind was a microcosm of dysfunction, a network of spies, informants, and sycophants conditioned to survive by secrecy and betrayal. The culture of suspicion that Ferdinand cultivated in his marriage had infected the entire machinery of state, and even after his death, courtiers measured their words, fearing that the habit of surveillance might still be alive in the regent's inner circle. And yet, the most macabre symbol of his reign lay far from the battlefield or the throne room. In a sealed chamber in the Vatican archives rested the preserved organ that had shaped his life's trajectory, an object of whispered fascination, too scandalous for public display, too emblematic of a king's humiliation to destroy. It was more than a medical curiosity. It was a monument to the way private shame can corrode public duty, and how one man's personal affliction could ripple outward to destabilize a nation. Ferdinand's story is not simply that of a bad king. It is a cautionary tale about the dangers of absolute monarchy, where the health, psychology, and personal life of one individual can dictate the fate of millions. He was both victim and perpetrator, a man deformed by the genetic arrogance of his ancestors, also a ruler who inflicted that deformity's consequences upon his wives, his court, and his country. The physician who, in 1834, preserved that infamous anatomical relic may have thought he was securing a piece of history. In truth, he was bottling a warning, for in Ferdinand's reign, Spain learned that a kingdom can be ruined as much by the intimate failings of its ruler as by any enemy at its gates, and that sometimes the most destructive force in politics is not war or famine or foreign invasion. It is the unchecked power of one broken man